G'day guys, my name is Harry Lamb and I'm the Insights Manager for Bliss across Australia and New Zealand. And this study is called Life After Lockdown. It's a piece that we conducted around late June, early July. And what we wanted to do was to give an understanding of what happens to consumers when they come out of lockdown, what happens to our sentiment, our behavior, and even our needs during a time like this. To find out, we did a quick survey to get a sense of how people were feeling, and then we used our footfall data to see what people are actually doing. In the time since this piece was originally released, part of Australia has since gone back into lockdown. But what we do have is about a month and a half of behavioural data where we got to observe both Australia and New Zealand experience post-lockdown life. And we uncovered some quite universal themes which we will explore. For those of you who aren't too familiar with us, Bliss is a location-powered advertising and analytics business. From analysis, activation, through to attribution, we use our proprietary tech to clean, scale, and contextualize location data. And it's all to help brands understand, engage, and reach consumers. And here are the questions that we're going to tackle today. Firstly, we'll take a quick look into how we got here in the first place, what happened during lockdown. And then we're going to dive straight into the three core themes of post-lockdown life. Firstly, we'll take a look at needs. Secondly, confidence. And then finally, we'll take a look at recovery and what factors are impacting our return to normality. So let's dive straight in and take a quick look into how we got here in the first place. Now, for both Australia and New Zealand, COVID-19 has been pretty much a part of our lives since about February. And for both countries, up until about 4 weeks ago, we actually had very, very similar journeys as well. We both entered and exited our first lockdown roughly around the same time, but under two very different circumstances. So New Zealand had a very successful lockdown. They had very, very clear guidelines and very strict guidelines, and had about a month of no new cases before they actually came out of lockdown. Whereas Australia, COVID-19 was and still is a live situation. And we're currently seeing a second wave at the moment in Melbourne. Now, this difference will have massive implications for sentiment of both countries coming out of lockdown, which we will explore. But in order to get to this stage, there was a tremendous price to pay. And that price ultimately was our normality. If you think about our own lives, everything from our habits, our routines, our behaviors, were all completely turned on its head during this time. It impacted the way that we worked, right? So even weeks before lockdown was actually implemented across most states in Australia, we started seeing a discernible decline in footfall into CBDs and workplaces, even before lockdown was actually put into place. And obviously, if you affect the way that we work, you're going to impact the way that we travel as well. So again, even before lockdown was implemented, we started seeing a discernible decline in all forms of transport across most capital cities. COVID-19 impacted the way that we shopped as well, right? So February and early March was characterized by panic buying and hoarding, but by late March and especially lockdown April, everything ground to a halt. And ultimately, it affected our leisure and recreation moments as well. The way that we socialize, the way that we unwind, the way that we exercise. There was barely a single thing that was left untouched during this period. And as marketers, I'm sure your brands have had very, very similar and overwhelming challenges during this time, trying to adjust and be creative on the fly, and even just to understand what's happened to consumers and how they've changed during this time. At the start of this journey, we've been really hard at work trying to help clients understand the impact of the lockdown on consumers. But for the past 2 months, we've refocused our attention more on recovery, and this is what this piece is all about. And to do this, we've been exploring the relationship between two very key areas: sentiment, which is basically what people feel, and behavior, which is literally what people do. For the sentiment piece, we did a quick survey around mid-June to get a sense of how confident or cautious consumers were coming out of lockdown. And for the behavioral piece, we've been measuring footfall across hundreds of thousands of places and locations over the past 6-7 months. Places like restaurants and cafes, all the way through to retailers, workplaces, and residential areas, all to understand how behaviors are evolving during this time. And what we quickly found was that what people say does not always translate that neatly into what people do, especially when we talk about needs. So if you think back to the time that we spent in March and April, and even before then in February, when there were all those shortages in the supermarkets and shopping centres, we've been pretty much in survival mode for about 2, 3 months. And one of the first things that we wanted to understand was, is this mindset still prevalent or have consumers actually moved on? So immediately after lockdown, one of the very first questions that we asked people was, how are they feeling about the prospect of being outside again? And what we found was that New Zealanders were significantly more comfortable with the idea of venturing outside again. So mentally, at least in terms of what they were saying, New Zealand seems a lot more ready for post-lockdown life. By comparison, Aussies are still a lot more cautious. Close to half the people that we surveyed, about 45%, expressed some level of concern about leaving the house, which is not too surprising when you consider the two very different circumstances in which both countries left lockdown. So given this difference in sentiment, how different then is behavior? How closely does this confidence translate into what consumers are actually doing? Well, what we found was that immediately after lockdown was lifted in New Zealand, the fastest growing areas were places like restaurants and bars and pubs and cafes. They were outdoor spaces like parks and beaches. People were socializing, they were partying, they were drinking, they were getting their hair cut, they were exercising. In other words, New Zealanders were prioritizing their psychological needs, their need for well-being, for fun, for social interaction. All these needs that you can imagine were suppressed during lockdown. And then we saw scenes like this, right? So in the week after lockdown was lifted, over 40,000 people went to watch a rugby game in New Zealand, double the average attendance, right? And this is in the middle of a pandemic. Really speaks to the need for some level of respite after living in survival mode for 2 or 3 months. And if you think about these locations, the footy ground, the restaurant, the bar, these are potentially quite crowded places. So you would think that confidence would be a major factor in driving footfall to these places. And yes, when we look at sentiment, New Zealanders are certainly a lot more confident when it comes to dining out. Over 60% expressed really no concern going to a restaurant or a bar during this time, compared to just 41% of Australians. And Aussies, again, are significantly less confident about something like traveling away, right? About 60% again indicate that they're still not that comfortable with the idea of going away during this time. So with these type of numbers, you'd probably be forgiven for thinking that Australia's post-lockdown behaviours surely must look very different. But when it comes to actual behaviour, the story is actually very familiar. So what we're seeing with our data is that despite expressing greater concern and caution, Aussies are still prioritising the same needs. We're still going to bars and restaurants and clubs. We're still socialising. We're still partying. We're still doing all those things that probably brought about the second wave in the first place. And we're seeing with travel as well, right? So again, despite expressing very real concerns, the very first chance that we got to travel interstate, the very first long weekend after lockdown, we saw an explosion of interstate travel, people seeking a very literal escape from survival mode. And the thing is, it's not just an Aussie thing, not just a Kiwi thing. These needs are rather universal. So this was a scene that we saw in Soho, London, the first weekend that pubs and bars reopened after about 2 or 3 weeks of lockdown. Barely any social distancing going on here. Really goes to show you what happens when you lock people down for 2 or 3 months. The same universal need to socialize, to be among other people, to unwind, to have fun, bubble to the surface. And that's exactly what the first key implication is, right? So despite expressing very real concern and caution, people are moving away from survival mode and looking to feel more human again. And it makes sense for brands to follow suit, whether it's associating with different types of content or even the type of messaging that we convey. Obviously, during this time, there's been a lot of really awesome empathetic messaging throughout this period, expressing support and concern for consumers. But there's probably an opportune time, sometime during post-lockdown, to account for this inevitable mindset shift. The second, more broader implication is that there can often be a mismatch between what people say and what people do. So I'm sure you guys are collating and conducting a lot of awesome research to understand what's happening with consumers right now. Including some behavioral data in there can really help you get a more complete consumer picture because it's literally a view into what people are actually doing. So we've talked a lot about how confidence and needs are driving behaviour despite caution. But this new, more cautious mindset is still very influential and it's impacting consumer behaviour in some not so subtle ways. And it's important for brands to take note. As we covered previously, Aussies are generally split down the middle when it comes to confidence or caution when heading outside. But the very minute we start using words like confined or crowded, that's when we really start to see confidence plummet, even in New Zealand. So the idea of being in a confined or crowded space with other people, like a train or a bus or a tram, or even a busy thoroughfare, is still quite confronting to a lot of people. 2 in 3 people that we surveyed still don't feel that comfortable catching public transport, for instance. And because of sentiment like this, consumers are adapting their behavior to mitigate the risk that they feel outside. And we started seeing this right at the very beginning. So right when COVID-19 really started to hit its peak in April, people were already moving away from public transport. And when they did decide to travel, they sought the relative comfort and safety of their cars. And we can see that even after lockdown, this trend is still continuing. So car travel, especially in Melbourne, is growing way faster than public transport. Really says a lot about the importance of control over one's environment and space during a time like this, and how consumers will adapt their behavior in reaction to their concerns. And people are also adjusting the time that they spend outside as well. So in the previous section, we covered how needs are influencing people to visit more places more often, but caution is causing them to spend less time in these moments. So post-lockdown, dwell time across almost every location type that we measure is down compared to what it used to be pre-COVID. So you can imagine if you used to spend maybe 40 minutes at a supermarket, now you're spending maybe 30 minutes there or 25 minutes there. With little adjustments to the time you spend outside, from a macro perspective, we're certainly noticing a discernible difference. People are dallying less. They're a lot more direct and purposeful in their outside interactions. So all the evidence is telling us that people want greater control in all facets of their out-of-home lives, whether that's greater convenience, or speed, or even proximity away from other people. And it makes sense for brands to accommodate their experiences, their brand experiences accordingly, especially if they have a physical presence. Whether that's making the online and offline experience a bit more seamless, or making that journey from browsing the transactions a bit more succinct. Giving consumers more options in the way they interact with brands is going to be increasingly important during this time. Secondly, because consumers are increasingly more direct and purposeful in their outside interactions, it may also mean that they become less prone to distractions when they're outside. Obviously, it's always important to reach the right audience in the right moments, but messaging also has a very important role to play during this time, especially outside the home. Making that message a bit more direct, a bit more purposeful, and to the point is likely to be more effective during this time. And with people spending more time at home and fewer spontaneous decisions being made outside the home, being able to predict when people will leave the home and when people will interact with brands is going to be really, really quite vital during this time. And having a data-led understanding of households and homes can really help with that. So we talked a lot about how concerns and needs are impacting behavior, but besides the actual pandemic itself, uncertainty is impacting our return to normality, especially that of a financial kind. So as we covered previously, about 45% of Australians are still not that confident about their safety outside the home. Yet a whopping 79% of Australians are still unsure about making a large financial decision in the long term, which is massive, which is the majority of the people that we surveyed. And excuse me. And the reality is people are just not really that sure, right? They're not really sure how the economy is going. They're not sure about their own household finances. There's a great deal of unknowns. And it's any wonder when we see numbers like this and we're living these numbers, right? So, all economic indicators from unemployment through the GDP, through to household expenditure, is all pointing towards a recession by the end of the year. So again, it's any wonder how this uncertainty and pessimism is translating to how recovery is happening in the real world. So what we're finding in our data is that recovery is happening, but it's happening at a different pace depending on where you live and the category that you're talking about. So according to our data, this is what happened to supermarket footfall across Sydney during the height of COVID. Visitation pretty much tanked everywhere. So whether it's the more affluent areas to the east, the more middle class centre, the working class west and southwest, the decline that we saw was pretty much the same everywhere that we looked. But in post-lockdown June, we see that recovery is happening, but it's not happening evenly. Certain areas are recovering a lot sooner than other areas, even for a category as broad and as middle of the road as supermarkets. And as we look into other categories, we certainly start to see noticeable patterns forming, especially when we look at different price points. So this is discount retail at the height of COVID. So these are your discount stores, your discount department stores, discount supermarkets, basically any environment that attracts a more value and budget conscious consumer. Again, very similar story in April, decline everywhere. But in June, recovery looks more like this. So we're seeing the highest growth occurring almost exclusively in the west and the southwest of the city. So this is pretty much Sydney's working class and lower middle class heartland. These are households across the lower end of the financial spectrum being forced to be even more value and budget conscious, even during a time like this. And when we look at the other extreme, the most expensive product that most people generally buy, and that's the car. Again, during lockdown, COVID-19 was pretty much, the impact of COVID-19 was pretty much evenly distributed across the city. But again, in June, recovery is happening in even more select areas. So besides notable outliers in Blacktown and Hornsby, these are your commuter belts, we're seeing recovery almost exclusively happening in the city's more affluent areas to the east and north. So recovery is happening, but it's happening at a very uneven pace. And understanding different lifestyle, life stage, and socioeconomic traits of different areas and places will be critical in helping brands understanding how, where, and when recovery actually happens. And as you just saw, location behavioral data is perfect for identifying the pace of change coming out of lockdown, identifying hotspots of confidence and areas where people are still a lot more cautious in their behaviors. And to that point, it stands to reason that confidence and caution will differ greatly depending on where you live, the different lifestyle and life stage that you're looking at. So being able to identify and adapt strategies according to different levels of confidence and caution will be really, really effective during a time like this. So in summary, the core themes of post-lockdown life are really quite universal. What happens when people are forced to isolate for 2 or 3 months? People are going to succumb to some very human, very innate needs. We're going to want to be around other people. We're going to want to unwind, to seek comfort and enjoyment, to feel human again. So it makes sense for brands to follow suit. What happens when the simple act of being outside and being among other people presents a safety risk? People are going to adjust their behavior. They're going to dally a bit less. They're going to be a bit more direct when they're outside. And again, it makes sense for brands to follow suit. And finally, what happens when you introduce uncertainty to the population? Different people will be at different levels of preparedness for economic uncertainty, for financial uncertainty. And it makes sense for brands to accommodate according to different levels of confidence and different levels of caution in the post-lockdown world. As behavior and the drivers behind behavior continue to evolve, the one certainty for brands in these uncertain times is that we will likely ebb and flow between confidence and caution over the coming months and years. And understanding how these factors impact audiences during this time will be critical in helping brands make better decisions. And we're here to help with that understanding. If you would like more information on anything we covered during this presentation, or would like us to explore ways to help with your business challenges, please don't hesitate to contact or reach us. Thank you for your time.